In Complicity by Iain Banks, a reporter believes he has found a connection between a series of grisly murders, but the only connection the police have seen is to him. He may not be guilty, but is he complicit? In this video, I will do a 5P review of Complicity using my modification of the 5P system developed by my friend Book Gabber of Book Talk. My version of the 5Ps has purpose, plot, etc., prose, personal, and position. I will give it a score of 5 for each category, and at the end, get the average of the 5 scores and have a final rating. But before I do, I like to give every novel a rating based entirely on vibes, and Complicity gets a 3.1 out of 5 for me, on vibes. So let's start with purpose. Why was Complicity written? What was its author trying to say? Iain Banks was very angry with the effects of over a decade of Tory politics in Scotland. If I knew more about Tory politics in that decade, I could say more. But I do know, based on the novel and based on additional research I did, which I admit was just surface level, that there was widespread unemployment caused by company closures, which were in turn caused by industries losing their government subsidies. And it also led indirectly to a rise in drug use among young people. There's also mention of the involvement in the Falkland Wars, but I'm really not well versed in that part of British history. I am sure, however, that someone who is Scottish or someone who has done more research will be able to say how each of the main characters is a satire of a specific effect of these policies or the social changes due to these policies. Banks uses 2 characters in particular to give voice to his anger and frustration. One is Cameron, the protagonist who plays the reporter, and the other is the killer. And I have to say, this is the most violent social critique I have ever read. But Iain Banks also said that he would stop writing violent books when we stopped living in a violent world, so fair play to him. For purpose, I give this a 3.5. The second category, plot, etc., is where I look at the literary elements. Plot, character, and setting are the big 3. For plot, I think I would have more to say if I read more thrillers. I normally read 0 thrillers a year. This has 2 stories running parallel to each other. The story of the killer and the story of Cameron, the reporter, who is being fed leads by a mysterious source who claims he can prove that all these deaths are actually linked. And of course, these 2 stories collide eventually in a pretty traumatic way. And I would say that it was really well plotted. The main thing I did not like about the plot was how violent some of the kills were. And not just violent, but creative in their violence. This killer refines or calibrates his method to the sin of his victim. And he's pretty good at what he does. He's the Mozart of murder, the Tchaikovsky of torture, what can I say? And while we're edging into character territory, let me just say that the protagonist, Cameron, is awful. He's barely sympathetic. Most of the characters in this are awful. I'd say the one exception is the police detective, but he plays such a small part and I don't remember his name at the moment, so not being awful didn't do much for him. There's also a sense that there's something a little bit rotten about the characters. Not in the sense that nobody's perfect, but in the sense that they are willingly nurturing their own vices. And as distasteful as I find that, I have to admit that that is part of the point. This is a well crafted choice in the story that Banks is telling. And in fairness, these characters are really well drawn. I would not be complaining so much about them if they weren't. It just made it hard to get into the story at the beginning. And finally, setting. Again, I don't know much about Scotland in the 80s and early 90s when this is set, but I understood what he was saying in an unexpected way when Cameron visits his friend Andy in a hotel that Andy bought. The hotel is run down, virtually abandoned, except for Andy, who is the only one living there. The town around it has become depressed due to lack of business. And the hotel is very clearly a reflection of what was happening to Scottish industry and Scottish society. And I understood it well as a symbol, even if I could not relate to the realities of Edinburgh as it was presented to me by Banks. And I had to see it. I had to see it for myself. I had to understand it through the language of symbol, if not through a journalistic presentation of the facts. And I'm going to bring in a fourth literary element now, which is point of view, the importance of really seeing what is actually there is reflected in the point of view. We have the first person point of view of Cameron, the gonzo reporter, and the second person point of view, interestingly enough, from the killer in his scenes. And I have to say, in general, as a piece of writing, this is really thoughtfully structured. There was a throwaway line by the killer in the first chapter that did not make sense until the big reveal. And no, not the big reveal of who the killer was, the big reveal of something else. And when I finally understood it, it blew my mind and it made me wonder what throwaway lines I had missed just because they didn't stand out for me the way that line did. And it's also not just in your face violence or in your face awfulness from the characters. There is symbolism here, and not just the symbolism of the hotel. And I could go on and on, actually. A lot of things are occurring to me right now, including the motif of the video games, the kind of video games that Cameron prefers to play, and the obscene symmetry of him deciding to play a game which involves detonating a nuclear warhead while he is at the hotel with Andy. The detonating of a nuclear bomb is pretty much as callous as you're going to get if you were a politician who could give the order for the bomb to be dropped. And he is sitting in a hotel which is decaying, and the hotel is in the middle of a town which has become depressed and nearly become a ghost town, also because of callousness from politicians, or at least that's what Banks is arguing. And the symmetry of that takes my breath away. I feel he got a little too gratuitous with the violence, but I guess another thing he wanted us to see was his anger. For such a high level of craft, minus this indulgence, I give this a 4 out of 5 for the literary elements. Now for prose. I like to describe the writing style in 3 words: And my three words for this are seedy, sharp, and smirking. Banks is giving us a tour of the industrial equivalent of a war zone. He wants us to see how bad it got, not just so we understand why Cameron is turning to drugs and other substances and video games and adultery with a woman he can never marry because she won't leave her husband. You know, he's trying to show us not just why Cameron is choosing an empty life, but also why the killer has chosen this sort of purposeful life. I understand why we need to see it clearly. I also think he rubbed our faces in it a little too much. Banks also clearly has sympathy for the killer and not much sympathy for Cameron, which is interesting. I also started to develop sympathy for the killer. I think I was supposed to and not supposed to at the same time. For prose, I give Complicity 3.5. Now for my personal opinion, which has nothing to do with anything that is outside of me. As I said, I don't really gravitate to thrillers. Complicity is not a book I would ever have chosen for myself if not for a reading challenge I'm doing this year, which is the Cloud Dancer Reading Challenge based on Pantone's Color of the Year, in which I read books that have white covers. And the first book, this is the second book I've read. The first book was The Unbearable Lightness of Being, which, as you can see, has an even whiter cover. And if you thought that Cloud Dancer was weird, why not just call it white? White is the absence of color, after all. These are two very different kinds of white. I am not trying to match Cloud Dancer, but any white will do. By the way, I also already have a 5 peer review on The Unbearable Lightness of Being, which you can check out in my 5 peer review playlist. Usually when coming up with my personal opinion, I ask, will I reread this book? I don't think I will. Another question I ask is, would I recommend this book? According to my research, Complicity is considered one of Banks' best works. If someone asked me about it, I would say that. But when it comes to mysteries, I think there are better mysteries to read, which I would recommend before this one. So on a completely personal level, I give this a 2 out of 5. Finally, position. What place does this novel have in the literary canon or in the greater culture? Well, it has a pretty great place in Scotland. Iain Banks is only the second contemporary Scottish novelist whom I've read, the first being, of course, Irvine Welsh, who wrote Trainspotting. And I don't want to compare too much, but Complicity did come from the same urban wasteland that inspired Trainspotting. And both of them were adapted into movies, and both movies starred Johnny Lee Miller. He was Sick Boy in Trainspotting, and he's Cameron in the Complicity movie, which in some markets is called Retribution. And I have to say that it holds its own apart from the context of Scottish society and Scottish politics and Scottish history. I think any modern country in which industries can quickly fail and masses of people can be unemployed and young people seeing no future turn to drugs, any of these societies can relate to what has happened in Complicity. You will also be able to relate to this if you're in a society where certain people can ride a wave of misfortune to make their own lives better while other people's lives get worse. In fact, when I was describing the story and the killer's motivation to some of my coworkers, They joked, can that killer come here? Can he target the people here who are the equivalent of the people he targets in the book? Can he come here and clean up the society too? That's why I think it will hit extra hard when it is revealed that the great sin here is not greed and not injustice, but betrayal. For position, I give this a 3.5. And when we add all of those scores together, we get another 3.1. This is the first time the vibes score and the 5P score have been equal, identical, and I don't know if this will happen again. This was a difficult review to do because this book is completely out of my wheelhouse as a reader and a reviewer. If you have thoughts on it, if you think I should have rated it higher, maybe lower, please let me know. I would love to read your comments.